In 1850, a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette was walking the sands of Saqqara, the vast ancient burial ground south of Cairo, when he came across the exposed head of a half-buried sphinx, something that reminded him of a passage he'd read in the ancient Greek geographer Strabo, describing an avenue of sphinxes leading to a mysterious underground temple. Mariette started digging, and what he eventually uncovered was one of the strangest structures in Egyptian archaeology, a long network of underground limestone tunnels carved deep beneath. The desert, lined on either side with alcoves, and sitting inside those alcoves, an almost unbelievable sight. 24 massive stone boxes, some weighing as much as 100 tons, carved from single solid blocks of granite and diorite, with lids alone weighing up to 30 tons, fitted into place with an internal precision that has genuinely puzzled and impressed researchers for over 170 years since. The site is called the Serapeum of Saqqara, and the conventional archaeological explanation, one that remains the accepted mainstream position, is that it served as the burial complex for the Apis bulls, sacred animals that ancient Egyptians worshipped as the living embodiment of the god Ptah, and later associated with the syncretic Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, which is where the site gets its modern name. The practice of ritually burying a sacred Apis bull dates back much further than the Serapeum's underground tunnels themselves, but the elaborate stone box tradition specifically appears to have taken shape primarily under the reign of Rameses II, around 1300 BCE, with construction and use of the underground galleries continuing across multiple later dynasties, all the way through the Ptolemaic period, before the site was finally abandoned shortly after 30 BCE, giving it an active history stretching across well over 1,000 years of continuous use and expansion, considerably longer than most single Egyptian monuments remained in active ceremonial use at all. The physical scale and material of these boxes is genuinely worth sitting with for a moment, because the numbers alone explain why this site keeps generating fascination. Most of the boxes are carved from rose granite, quarried at Aswan, a genuinely difficult stone to work, roughly 6-point offset on the 10-point Mohs hardness scale, and hauled from a quarry located more than 800 kilometers away from Saqqara. A smaller number of the boxes are made from an even harder stone, diorite, rated closer to 7 on that same hardness scale, sourced from a quarry located even further from the construction site. That's a genuinely important detail worth pausing on because limestone, readily available in massive quantities in the immediate area around Saqqara itself, would have been vastly easier to quarry, transport, and carve, and would have served the basic practical function of housing a burial equally well. The builders very deliberately chose not to take that easier path, instead, committing to transporting and precisely shaping some of the hardest, most distant stone available to them, a choice that only makes sense if the difficulty and material itself carried real symbolic or religious weight beyond simple practical function. The precision of the finished boxes is where a lot of popular retellings of this story genuinely overstate the case, and it's worth being careful and honest about exactly what's actually been measured versus what gets repeated online without much scrutiny. Some sources, and quite a lot of viral articles and videos, describe internal surfaces, flat to within thousandths of an inch and corners square to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, framing the boxes as achieving a level of geometric precision that would challenge even modern industrial machining. Independent researchers who have gone back to actually remeasure the boxes directly, rather than simply repeating decades-old informally sourced claims, have pushed back specifically on some of these more extreme precision figures, describing them as exaggerated relative to what direct physical measurement actually supports. What does hold up under more careful, skeptical re-examination is still genuinely impressive on its own terms without needing exaggeration. Remarkably straight edges, close to true right angles at the corners, notably flat internal chamber walls and lids that sit flush against their boxes with only minimal gaps, an accomplishment that required real skill and enormous patience to achieve using ancient tools, even without needing to inflate the specific numbers into something approaching an engineering impossibility. The explanation mainstream Egyptology offers for how this precision was actually achieved is the same fundamental technique documented at the Aswan unfinished obelisk and covered by experimental archaeologists studying granite work across ancient Egypt more broadly, skilled craftsmen using hard diorite, pounding stones, a volcanic rock harder than the granite itself, to gradually peck, shape, and hollow out the boxes, combined with fine quartz sand as an abrasive polishing agent, worked by hand with wooden or copper tools to smooth and flatten the interior surfaces, with straight edges and set squares used, systematically throughout the process to check and correct flatness and angle as the work progressed, exactly the kind of patient, iterative quality control process a skilled craftsman relying on manual tools would need to employ to achieve a genuinely flat, square result across a surface this large. This isn't a theoretical explanation invented after the fact to explain away an otherwise inexplicable object. It's a technique directly, physically demonstrated to work through experimental archaeology, and it's consistent with tool marks, quarry evidence, and abandoned or partially finished stone pieces found at multiple other ancient Egyptian granite working sites. It's worth being fair, though, to the strongest specific claim raised by writers skeptical of this conventional explanation, because it's a real specific assertion, rather than vague incredulity, and it deserves to be addressed directly rather than dismissed. The engineer Christopher Dunn, author of The Giza Power, plant and a frequent voice in alternative Egyptian technology theories, has stated that he contacted a modern manufacturing firm in the United States and asked whether they could replicate one of the Serapeum boxes as a single, solid piece of granite, and that the firm told him, even with an unlimited budget, they would still need to construct the piece from 6 separate sections rather than one continuous block. This claim gets repeated constantly across articles and videos covering this site, almost always exactly as Dunn originally phrased it. What's genuinely important to flag here, in the interest of being accurate rather, than simply repeating something because it sounds compelling, is that this specific claim rests entirely on an unnamed manufacturing company and an informal conversation that has never been independently documented, published, or verified through any peer-reviewed engineering source, meaning there's no way for anyone outside that original private conversation to actually confirm which specific manufacturing constraint was being described, what techniques and equipment were actually considered, or whether the claim reflects a genuine physical limitation of modern stoneworking or simply one company's informal, non-binding response to a hypothetical, off-the-cuff request. It's a claim worth being aware of, since it circulates so widely, but it isn't independently verified evidence, and treating it as settled proof of anything isn't something the actual documentation available can support. Where the real, still genuinely unresolved mystery of the Serapeum actually lives isn't in the precision of the stonework itself, which has a solid, demonstrated conventional explanation, but in a much stranger archaeological fact that gets far less attention in the more sensational coverage of this site. Despite the site's identification as a burial complex for sacred Apis bulls, and despite the enormous material cost and effort invested in each individual box, the overwhelming majority of the 24 boxes discovered inside the Serapeum were found completely empty. Only one is documented as containing actual fragmentary remains, mummified bull bone fragments alongside traces consistent with an actual ancient burial. Some of the other boxes show clear signs of having been broken into and looted in antiquity, which would at least partially explain their empty state, but a meaningful number show no clear evidence of ever having been looted at all, simply empty from the point archaeologists first opened them. A detail that has led some researchers to ask a genuinely reasonable question that doesn't require any exotic explanation to take seriously whether every one of these boxes was actually intended as an active, individual burial container in the first place, or whether at least some of them may have served a different function within the broader ceremonial complex, prepared and finished to full ritual standard as part of an ongoing religious tradition and construction program, without every single one necessarily ever receiving its own specific, unique burial. It's also worth noting that even the well-documented earlier phase of Apis bull burial practice, before this elaborate stone box tradition developed under Ramesses II, used much simpler wooden coffins, which raises a genuine, still openly discussed question among Egyptologists about exactly why and exactly when the ritual tradition escalated so dramatically toward this specific level of monumental hardstone construction, a real shift in religious and material practice that current archaeological research hasn't fully definitively explained. There's also a smaller, stranger detail worth including, because it's a genuine, documented archaeological observation rather than speculation. On a handful of the boxes, hieroglyphic inscriptions were added, but researchers examining these inscriptions closely have noted that the carving quality of the hieroglyphs themselves is noticeably rougher and less refined than the extraordinarily smooth, precisely finished surfaces of the boxes they're carved onto, suggesting the specialized craftsmen who achieved that remarkable level of polish and precision on the stone itself weren't necessarily the same workers, or didn't necessarily possess the same specific skill set as whoever was responsible for adding the later inscriptions. That's a genuinely interesting, concrete piece of evidence about how specialized and compartmentalized ancient Egyptian craft labor actually was, different trades handling different stages of the same monument's construction, with real, visible differences in skill level between them, rather than evidence of anything mysterious about the box's original manufacture. Put together, the honest picture of the Serapeum of Saqqara is a site that doesn't need an exaggerated precision claim or an unverified anecdote about modern manufacturing limits to remain genuinely one of the more fascinating unresolved puzzles in Egyptian archaeology. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen, using a well-documented, physically demonstrated technique of hard stone pounders and abrasive sand, the same basic method that shaped the unfinished obelisk at Aswan and countless other granite monuments across Egypt, spent well over a millennium continuously producing and refining an increasingly elaborate stonebox tradition for a sacred bull cult, hauling some of the hardest, most distant stone available to them across hundreds of kilometers, specifically because the difficulty itself appears to have carried real religious meaning, and then for reasons that remain genuinely, honestly unresolved in the current archaeological record, left the overwhelming majority of their finished, painstakingly precise creations completely empty. That's not a mystery about lost technology. It's a mystery about ancient religious practice and ritual intention, arguably a more interesting kind of unanswered question than a simple engineering puzzle, because it's asking not how these people built something extraordinary, which experimental archaeology has already answered convincingly, but why an entire civilization kept dedicating this staggering level of material cost and specialized labor to boxes that, by every indication currently available, were never actually going to be used the way their design so clearly suggests they were meant to be.